invite Mr. Frank DeMeglio, a lecturer of classical music at the School of Contemporary Music, LaSalle College of the Arts. Mr. DeMeglio is a classical music teacher, lecturer, and writer. Having taught part-time at LaSalle since 2003, he joined the faculty in 2009. He has also been teaching the keyboard literature course for the Yongsu-to Conservatory of Music since 2004. Mr. DeMeglio began studying the Taubman approach in 1986 with Professor Joseph Gert and Ms. Sheila Page, as well as in several master classes with Dorothy Taubman. In New York City, he continued his study of the Taubman approach with Edna Golansky, founder of the Golansky Institute, and John Bloomfield. It is our privilege today to have Mr. DeMeglio take us through the Taubman approach. Mr. DeMeglio, please.
Good morning, and thank you for your introduction. And I also want to thank the Performing Arts Group for inviting me to give this talk and this introductory talk about the Taubman approach. Before I go on, can everybody see the screen clearly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Many of the points that I was going to talk about have already been touched upon by Mandy, Dr. Jason, and by Leonard as well. I might reiterate some of these points, but I'm happy to know that the medical profession is so in touch with the common kinds of injuries that a lot of musicians can suffer. I think there's a huge need for the application of sports medicine and coordinate movement in the rehabilitation of injured musicians. And my perspective is going to be through the lens almost exclusively of injured pianists. But the coordinate movement, corrective movements that can help overcome pain and suffering amongst pianists can also be applied to the keyboard, like a computer keyboard. And I'll touch upon that in the second half of the presentation. In the next 20-25 minutes, I hope to accomplish two main things, and that is to give you a brief overview of the Taubman approach, again, specifically viewed through the lens of helping the injured pianist overcome pain and injury. And the second part will be to demonstrate some practical solutions to common movement ailments that, if unchanged, could lead to long-term pain and injury. Now, today we're going to talk about the injured pianist. As healthcare professionals, you know why someone might be injured and how to fix them up. What I know is what the specific movement habits are and what the root causes are behind the injury and how they hurt. And I think by combining both a medical approach to fixing up an injury and then the corrective movements technically, we can really have a more complete solution to overcoming injured artists. And I know this intimately because I basically lived that journey. By the time I was in my early 20s, I had a double whammy, really, of almost continual pain from a variety of repetitive strain injuries in both forearms. And unknown to me at the time, I was beginning to exhibit the early symptoms of what would later be diagnosed 25 years later as Parkinson's. Now, in Aprin's introduction of me earlier, you heard that I studied with Joseph Gert. He was the first teacher that I encountered who was familiar with the Taubman approach. And it was really great fortune that he lived in a university town just outside the University of Michigan where I was attending at the time. And within a very few lessons with him, I realized that the Taubman approach represented a body of work that could really change lives for the better. And so I began studying with Joseph, and that was the start really of a 35-year journey of studying, teaching, and advocating for the Taubman approach. Later, when I moved to New York City, I was fortunate to have studied with the very best teachers of the Taubman approach. I had several master classes and seminars with Dorothy herself. I studied for 3 years with Edna Golansky, and she was the longtime director of the Taubman Institute, and more recently the founder of her own institute, the Golansky Institute, today's leading advocate for the Taubman's methods. And I've also had a number of lessons with John Bloomfield, who is the current director of the Golansky Institute. Now, the fact that I was able to overcome so many kinds of repetitive strain injuries early in my career and also the early symptoms of Parkinson's to the point where I could even have a career in music at all, I think that quite simply would have been impossible without the benefits of the Taubman approach. And really, I can't think of any stronger testimony for its effectiveness than that it worked for me. This is something that has been touched upon by Leonard and Jason in their talks. And that is that most musicians are in pain. I wish I could say that my case was unique, but it's not. One way in which musicians are very much like athletes is that, to a large extent, pain just doesn't matter. For many pianists, pain is normal. In fact, we look at pain through a different lens. To us, pain means that we're really pushing ourselves to grow as a performer and to go beyond our current limits of speed and accuracy and endurance, strength, and control. Pain tells us that we're willing to sacrifice for our art. In other words, if we're in pain, that could mean that we're truly serious musicians. And as Leonard said earlier, most of us wear our pain almost like a badge of honor, right up to and beyond the point of injury. And how much pain are we willing to endure? Well, sadly, the answer is whatever it takes to learn a composition, bring it to that polish of perfection, and then reliably execute it under pressure. In other words, if you can play, you're not hurt. The only time that we're injured enough to count that as an injury is if it forces us to stop practicing our art. And as you know, by then it's often too late. So by the time most medical professionals see a musician, it's not that they're experiencing a little bit of pain or that they have a small injury. By the time you get to see us, usually it's because that pain is so unbearable that we can no longer perform at an elite level. In other words, it's not that we've been recently injured, we've been injured. Now, I find that the Taubman approach really is remarkably effective in solving all piano technical problems. Dorothy began putting her approach together in the 1950s, and she borrowed a lot of material from original thinkers about piano technique and synthesized them into a body of work that has really solved every problem or challenge that I've yet encountered in piano playing. But despite that, I think that Dorothy's greatest contribution really is the precision of her language and imagery that allows her approach to be systematically repeated and duplicated. I remember attending the Amherst symposiums that she would run in the late 1980s. And the attitude of the lectures during that time was still very much us against the world. In other words, Dorothy felt she had to fight and push to get her ideas into the marketplace and accepted. And I'm really happy to know that just a few decades later, that her revolutionary approach to piano technique is being looked at as a viable therapeutic option. Now, one caveat, and it's interesting that when Dr. Cha was speaking, he said, I'm a doctor, not a dancer. Well, for my case, it's pretty much the opposite. I'm definitely not a doctor. And so I'm not going to use any technical or anatomical terms in my demonstration of the Taubman principles. What I do is look at poor movement habits and understand what needs to be changed in order to stop somebody from hurting. In other words, I observe the hands at the piano, and based on the way the hands are moving, I have a pretty good idea of where the pianist might be hurting, and I know what needs to change in order to fix it. So in other words, I correct faulty technique. I've never diagnosed a student with an injury. In other words, I don't know if somebody has carpal tunnel or if they have the beginning of focal dystonia. In fact, the kind of injury that somebody has doesn't really matter to me because I know that healthy movement eliminates pain. And I've seen this work time and again. Within usually a couple of lessons, whatever injury that somebody's complaining about, the pain that causes usually just goes away. That doesn't mean that the underlying injury is gone. That still needs to be addressed. But what it does mean is that healthy movement results in pain-free piano playing. Okay, and with that, I would like to introduce three basic principles of the Taubman approach. Now, these are not the three basic principles, but there are three of the basic principles. Now, Dorothy began filming her summer symposiums, and later she released a 10-volume CD set that comprised of more than 20 hours of instructions and introduction to her technical approach. And I have remaining now approximately 20-some minutes left in the talk. there's no way that I can cover 20 hours of material in the next 20 minutes. So I had to choose which principles to look at. And I've chosen 3 that I think I can demonstrate over Zoom that can be covered in some detail in our remaining time, and also that will be most useful to you in terms of understanding the ideas behind them, implementing them, and having some degree of success, either with your students or with your patients. So the first idea I'm going to cover is seat height and how to sit properly at the piano. And I know you might be thinking that you wanted to understand the more sophisticated aspects of the Talman approach and how to change your technique. And the idea of seat height might not be the sexiest idea, but it's really the foundation of the system in terms of coordinating the finger, hand, and arm and getting the most out of the playing apparatus. So with that, could we switch the screen over to Valerie? Could we move the screen over? Okay, can everybody see Valerie?
Yeah, we can see her.
Okay, thank you. All right, and in terms of seat height, the most important thing to note is that when Valerie's hands are on the keyboard, that her elbow is at or just slightly above the level of the white keys. This places the forearm in a position where the weight of the arm can lean forward into the keys and assist the finger in getting the key down. Now, the keys don't weigh a lot on a piano. They're approximately 48 grams, which is not too much. But if you're requiring the finger to do all of the job of putting the key down repeatedly for hours at a time for decades, it can result in a great deal of fatigue, strain, or injury to the muscles that move the fingers. What we're going to look at are 3 basic ways of sitting at the piano: too high, too low, and just right. And what the position Valerie's in right now is an ideal position for the forearm to assist with its weight in getting the key down. I'm not going to ask Valerie to adjust the bench and sit all the way down so it's very visible that she's sitting too low. Now, when Valerie puts her hands back on the keys, you're going to notice that her elbow is far below the level of the keys. In this position, the weight now is falling backwards off the keyboard and toward her elbow. One of the results of this is that Valerie's hands are going to be forced to clutch to hold onto the keys to prevent her fingers from falling off. And by clutching the keys, she's created a strain in her forearm and tightened her fingers, her wrist, and her forearm. And that makes optimal playing very difficult to do. Now, much like an athlete, when a pianist plays faster, they have to balance their body over a surface that can move quickly. In the case, for example, of a sprinter, that would be the bottom of their feet. In the case with a pianist, it's the fingertips. So if Valerie in this position is playing a passage that's faster, she's got to bring her arm to a position that allows the weight to balance more on her fingertips so she can play quickly. And the way that a pianist sitting too low would do this would be to begin by raising her shoulders as a way of bringing her elbows closer to the level of the white keys. So can you hunch your shoulders? You can see Valerie's shoulders just moved up, and that causes tension in the upper neck area. Now, if that's not high enough, a pianist can further compensate by tightening her spine and trying to lengthen it. Yeah. And now you can see that the arms have raised a little bit closer to the height of the white keys, but Valerie's neck, shoulders, and back are tight. If that's still not high enough, a pianist might lift the elbows out and to the side. Okay, I hope you can see how uncomfortable Valerie looks right now. Okay, you can relax. If the seat is too high, now we have the opposite problem. So Valerie's now going to raise the bench all the way to the top. So we've got the opposite problem here where the arm instead of dragging on the keyboard, now is floating too far above it. If Valerie wanted to play with more arm weight, she would then have to force her arms down. And one way to do that would be to drop the wrist. And you can see that the bent wrist now, again, causes tension in the hands and the fingers and the forearm. If a pianist is sitting even higher than that, they might try to push their shoulders down as a way of forcing their elbows to come into alignment with the white keys. And so once again, Valerie has moved her shoulders, her wrists, and her fingers into a position that not only is uncomfortable, but that makes virtuosic playing almost impossible. Now, in addition to positioning the bench at exactly the right height, the distance from the keyboard is also important. So Valerie, can you put the bench now in a more comfortable position? Okay. Now I'm going to ask Valerie to intentionally move the bench as close to the piano as possible so that it's just uncomfortable. And I want Valerie to pretend like she's playing a passage high on the keyboard and moving her arm from the outside of her body close to the inside. And you can see that as Valerie's hand passes in front of her, if she's sitting too close to the keyboard, her torso becomes an obstruction to her elbow. And there's really only one of two solutions. Either, when you do that again, Valerie, either she's going to lean backwards and allow her elbow to pass in front of her body, which will give her the sensation of being out of balance, and it's very awkward, or she'll have to contort her hand so that it's able to pass in front of her body. And that's either by dragging the wrist or by pushing her hand forward and dragging her elbow. The opposite problem occurs if she's too far from the piano. So slide as far back as you can. Now from this position, when Valerie puts her hands on the piano, in order to stay balanced, she might need to lift her arms from the front of her shoulder. And so that her hands, her shoulders will be a little bit tense, and that will cause fatigue within a short period of time to her shoulders. The ideal position is where the elbows are just slightly in front of the body and freely hanging from the shoulders. Just like that. Okay, now for the second idea. The second main idea that I'm going to talk about is alignment. And we're specifically talking about the alignment of the arm and the hand. Valerie, can you drop your hand to the side? I'm going to ask Valerie to shake her arm out so that her hands are nice and free and relaxed. Valerie's going to lift her arm up along the side and then just flip her arm over. There. Now Valerie has alignment in two dimensions of her arm. The first is that her hand and forearm are almost in a level line. And the second is that her hand is what I call straight to the forearm. Valerie, can you hold your hand like this up to the camera? And that's an aligned hand. In other words, the hand is situated comfortably over the forearm. Now, can you take your forearm, Valerie, and turn it toward the thumb? This way. And that would be a twisted hand, and I'll show some examples of how that hand position can impede free and easy piano playing. All right, put your hand back down, shake it out. I know once you adopt healthy piano playing habits, doing something intentionally wrong can feel bad really quickly. The last idea I'm going to talk about is maintaining the hand in its ideal hand position. And that is to maintain the hand in its natural shape. So the first way that the hand position can go awry is usually comes from the very first lesson that any of us have had in terms of piano playing. And I've asked a number of students that have been my students long ago and students that I have now. And for most of us, from the very first lesson we got, we were told that the traditional hand position is to imagine you're holding a round object in your hand, like a small ball or an orange or an apple. And this seems like a sensible instruction because it gives the feeling to the fingers that they're strong and stable. But I'd like to do an experiment with everybody now. Valerie, can you show your hand and imagine you're holding a ball in your hand? Maybe a little bit bigger ball, like that. I want everyone to open their hands and to assume this holding a ball shape. Now just wiggle your fingers with your hands in that shape. And you should feel that there's a certain degree of tension and discomfort in the hands. Now shake your hand out and bring your hand into its natural shape. Now with your fingers, moving from the main knuckle joint, just wiggle your fingers back and forth. And you should feel that your hands now are much freer and easier to move. One of the reasons that having rounded fingers feels like the fingers are stronger is what Dorothy called a muscular co-contraction, and that is the flexors and extensors are pulling simultaneously. So the fingers aren't really any stronger, they're just really stiff. And the bad long-term effect of this is that from the very first lesson you get at the keyboard, you've already limited the top-end development that you can achieve. In other words, by introducing a tension and stiffness into the hands from the very first lesson, you'll never reach your potential in terms of potential virtuosity. Okay, I heard a little ding of a bell, which means I've got about 4.5 minutes left. And so I will cover one more idea when it comes to hand positioning at the piano, and that is the twisting of the hand. Valerie, can you once again show your hand in a badly twisted position? This is what Dorothy called a twisted hand, or what we know as an ulnar deviation. Now, why would you get into this position? Well, I don't think teachers would intentionally tell a student to play this way, but the hand position like this is a result, usually, of the thumb being played at the keyboard, both in chords and in scales. I'm going to ask Valerie now to play a simple scale, moving from the pinky to the fourth finger, the ring finger, middle finger, the index finger, and ending on the thumb. And what most students will do is to move the hand in a way that progressively twists or deviates the hand as you near the thumb and then play the thumb. I know that this is a little bit difficult to see because the motions are so small, but one way to avoid this kind of twisting and a much healthier way to move is, once again, to maintain alignment and to keep the hand in its natural shape. So Valerie's going to do the same scale now, but what I'm going to ask her to do is, as she moves from the pinky to the ring finger, to the middle finger, the index, and the thumb, to gradually move her entire arm forward so that she comes to a point of rest on the thumb in alignment instead of with a twist. And just one more way that sometimes students end up twisted in the corrective action. If you're playing a group of notes together, and we call that a chord, if you're playing a group of notes together and the thumb is being on a black note, the tendency to reach toward the thumb would be to twist the arm toward the thumb and to play the notes. Can you play an A major chord with the thumb on C sharp? Okay, and can you twist your thumb to it and play? So Valerie just played a chord where her thumb was turned toward the black note and it ended up in an ulnar deviation. The way to avoid this is to make sure that the longer fingers play closer to the edges of the ends of the key and that the hand stays straight and in its natural position. Can you try that? And so now Valerie's hand maintains its natural shape and the hand stays aligned to the forearm and the hand can be much freer of tension. Okay. Well, I wish we had more time today to go over more details of the Tauman approach. But I hope that the takeaways that you get are that technique needs to be addressed, that for the injured musician, especially the injured pianist, that pain resulting from poor technique can be quickly overcome. Another point, of course, is that the underlying injury needs to be addressed. And so that I think a combination of corrective technique and proper diagnosis and corrective regime will make for a very strong combination. Something else that I think we don't address often enough, certainly as artists, is that we've normalized a culture of pain and suffering. And so we need to communicate to the artists the idea that suffering is not normal and it's not healthy. Thank you for the opportunity to present these ideas to you. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them during the question and answer segment. Thank you very much. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you, Mr. DeMeglio. We will now have our first Q&A session. Do continue to post your questions in the Q&A box. Dr. Jason Chia, thank you for answering a few questions in the Q&A.